Yes, my name is Dr. Warren Pearce. I'm Senior Lecturer in Digital Methods, Science and Society at the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. I work, broadly speaking, on what you might call science in public across a whole range of different case studies. And by that, I mean science in a very broad sense. So I would include like social science in that as well. And yeah, I've spent my career mainly looking at climate change as a case study, and looking at climate change as an issue from all kinds of different angles and also disciplinary perspectives. But I have also, as I've got kind of a broader interest in this idea of science in public, I've also looked at some other case studies as well, did some work around COVID-19 and some health discussions around that, and two or three other sort of cases as well. But yeah, most of my research has been focused on climate, but I feel like a couple of these other case studies have helped sort of understand a bit more what's going on, I guess, particularly in these digital spaces, because a lot of these issues do sometimes overlap with each other. Very broadly speaking, I'm usually looking at how digital platforms, by which I mean things like social media platforms, but also sometimes like search engines as well. That will be another really important example. How these digital platforms mediate scientific knowledge, mediate public interactions with scientific knowledge, and the issues that knowledge informs and constitutes. Just clarify what I mean when I talk about those two terms, because they're used sort of sometimes a bit interchangeably, I guess, by some people anyway. So I guess misinformation, I would characterize, the simplest way to characterize it would be misinformation are things which are, I guess, misleading, broadly speaking. I mean, sometimes there can be things which are not necessarily, they could be narrowly accurate. They don't necessarily need to be inaccurate or untrue, but can be misleading in the way that they've been presented. Disinformation is usually described as something which is, I guess, like a subset of that, but something that's been deployed specifically to mislead. That is the intention. I guess there's lots of different kind of overlapping descriptions and definitions in the literature, but that's probably the easy to think about the two things. Well, the problem with that is ascribing intentionality to somebody about whether they're intended to mislead can be sometimes a bit tricky. But yes, so within climate, I mean, probably climate change and maybe the issues around tobacco are the two classic examples of public issues heavily imbued with scientific information, scientific knowledge, where misinformation or disinformation have been extremely important issues and extremely important controversies within those issues and how they're discussed, who's providing the information, how that information is working its way into all kinds of different fora, media, policy reports, and so on. The advent of the explosion of digital media in the last, let's say, 15 years or so, particularly social media, has really, I guess, turbocharged these controversies, debates. Climate change is, as an issue, has been, scientific knowledge is fundamental to how we've come to know climate change as an issue. And the reason for that is the huge scales which climate change operates on, both temporally, globally. It really cuts across something that Sheila Jasanoff wrote sort of 15 years ago, which was saying that climate change really sort of essentially messes with the way that we understand the world in terms of these kind of scales. It's very uncomfortable knowledge. It's quite hard knowledge to sort of get one's head around. And we may look out the window now, particularly at this time of year, and we may think, oh, spring has come slightly earlier than it used to. So we may see things now with our own eyes, which climate change, which we understand as climate change, but we would not have done that. We would not recognise that without the role of scientific knowledge. The way that scientific knowledge has been organised through the United Nations and the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's been an unprecedented human endeavour in making sense of our scientific understanding across all kinds of different disciplines. Again, I don't just mean physical science, all kinds of social sciences as well, including economics. It's been an unprecedented endeavour to kind of understand what's going on around an issue. The reason I mention all this is that it's one of the issues on like policy agendas which is most imbued with scientific knowledge. Scientific misinformation and disinformation has proved a really so if one is a bad actor and one is what's called a bad actor and wanting to derail or delay policy progress on climate change, spreading misinformation or disinformation about climate change, or even just kind of like increasing doubt about climate change, climate science, has proved to be an effective tool, effective way of doing that. Yeah, as I said, I mean, maybe not so much now, but certainly, 20 or 30 years ago, when we were completely reliant on scientific knowledge to understand climate change and define climate change. Therefore, climate science has been susceptible to these kind of, let's call them attacks, if you want to call them attacks, or tactics around misinformation and disinformation. I won't necessarily say bad actors here, but let's just say, so a very common example would be, well, the way I would frame it would be around like the susceptibility of climate change or public understanding of climate change to matters of scientific uncertainty. So a classic example of this, which comes around very regularly, is around extreme weather events, hurricanes, also wildfires, are the two most, when these occur, it is now very commonplace for that to be accompanied by commentary, discussion, evidence about how those events are linked to climate change or the extent to which they are the result of anthropogenic human-caused climate change. There are some broad things we can say about, so the IPCC will say, or does say, about expectations around changes in weather, extreme weather events over time, what they expect in the future. But it's also fair to say that there are always some uncertainties around these events. These events occurred previously, before we had human-caused climate change. So they're not perfectly the result of climate change, but they probably are, almost certainly are being exacerbated to some degree. Fossil fuel emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Well, first, it's fertile ground for scientific discussion and debate, but it's also fertile ground for confusion, doubt, impactful or upending ways of life that we're used to. They're often portrayed that way. Therefore, we shouldn't be leaping into them until we have more certainty. And that's been a tactic that's been used, certainly going back to the second, George Bush II in the US. That was a classic tactic that was used by that administration, saying that we need more research. There's too much uncertainty. We can't do anything now. And indeed, ironically enough, they funded a lot of climate science as a result of that, because they said we needed more evidence before we went forward. So that's quite a common and recurring example of how these kind of debates play out, and they leverage, not always, but often leverage legitimate scientific uncertainty and debate for ends which are essentially to do nothing or delay. They're sometimes called discourses of delay, so delaying policies that might tackle the problem. There is an organisation in the UK called the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which is quite a sort of neutral sounding name, but they are, let's say, they are widely associated with a view that should be doing very little about climate change. They wouldn't describe themselves as this, but they would be typically described as climate skeptics, or some people would certainly describe them as climate deniers. An organisation set up by Nigel Lawson, a Conservative politician, in 2010, I think. So this organisation for a long time had, so at the top of its website, it had a logo, this little logo, but it also had a scientific chart, like a line chart. And this was a chart which, now the year, I can't remember the exact years, but it was a chart of average global temperature over 5 years. And this was around the time of the mid 2010s. And during this time, there was a mini scientific debate, controversy, I think it's fair to say, over something called the pause. essentially it was a point where average global temperature was not increasing, it was flat. And this was seized upon by organisations like the Global Warming Policy Foundation as evidence that climate change was not progressing as per the models. There was predictions within certain error bars of average global temperature going up over time. If you looked on a graph at these projections, they were kind of like going up sort of steadily like that. And then what we saw on like the reality, the observations, was that it had gone up and then it was flattening out like that, and it looked like it was about to break out of these error bars, uncertainty bars. This caused a lot of scientific debate, like in legitimate literature. There were sort of articles in Nature Climate Change and all kinds of like climate science journals about whether this was like a real hiatus, like controversies over temperature, controversies over data, two essentially conflicting sort of schools of thought on this about how important or how even real this was. But certainly this controversy debate was seized upon by this organisation to the extent that this chart was at the top of every page on their website. What happened after that was temperature started going up again. It had flattened off for a bit, and the reasons for that are kind of like still debated to the extent that people think they're sort of interesting. But after about 5 years, the line sort of continued to wiggle up again, and the Global Warming Policy Foundation removed the chart from their website when this started to happen, because it was no longer useful evidence, I guess, for their purpose. So that is a good example, I think, of how nothing, at least in that little part of their website that they were presenting, was false. So this chart was an accurate representation of what was going on within those 5 years. There was a legitimate, scientific debate going on at the time in the literature about this phenomenon. But as soon as this bit of evidence, as soon as this kind of metric ceased to be of strategic use to this organisation, it was ditched. And now, I would say, now sort of fast forwarding about, I guess this was about 8, 9, 10 years ago now, the same organisation, or the latest iteration of this organisation, is far more focused on things around economic costs, essentially, of climate policies, than things to do with climate science. So those kind of debates and those kind of strategic resources, epistemic resources, I guess, which those kind of actors are using, have moved on a bit from being sort of science-based, and say they're now quite often around economics, or even some things to do with culture as well, I guess. But it's a good example of how certain bits of data, I guess cherry picking, it's like, what a way of describing it, can be used at some times when they're useful, and then cast aside when they cease to be useful. Well, I guess there's two ways to look at it, right? So the obvious way, and the way that talked about a lot, and I do agree with, is that there's a certain level of, it's a disingenuous approach to using scientific evidence to support one's arguments about what we should do in the world. A lot of people accuse a lot of people in all kinds of different areas of life about using data or evidence in a disingenuous way, and it doesn't necessarily have to just come from climate skeptic sides. Yeah, it could come from other areas within climate change, could come from other perspectives as well. The issue is that there is no perfect way of employing scientific evidence to support one's argument. There are always certain things which one will highlight as interesting, and inevitably there will be some things which are left out of a particular analysis. And a really good perspective on this from, 15, 20 years ago now, was by Steve Rayner, who described this as uncomfortable knowledge. So there is some knowledge. So to go back to my example of the hiatus, the pause, that was extremely uncomfortable knowledge, it was uncomfortable knowledge for a lot of people at the time who were advocating for climate policies, because there was a debate about what was going on, I mean, some people, a lot of climate scientists just thought this was like a temporary blip, but many others weren't so sure. And we have a similar thing now, where now, temperatures are increasing by more than was expected. So we have a similar sort of like debates and controversies in the literature, but in the other direction. That is always something to be wrestled with in the use of scientific evidence to support political arguments. Evidence-based policy, for example, is something that's talked about all the time, but that is not a perfectly rational status. And there's always going to be some value judgments, I guess, about what kinds of evidence one uses to support one's arguments. And even, as I go back to what I said at the start about how the IPCC is this kind of unprecedented organization and evaluation of scientific knowledge. So in some ways we have, well, not in some ways, it is a fantastic resource, and is almost treated, it's regularly treated as, okay, some kind of argument going on about what's going on in climate science. We'll check the IPCC report, the latest report, and find out what the real perspective, our best perspective is. But of course, even the IPCC has had many criticisms about it being, too conservative sometimes. There's so many scientists involved that essentially there's, there always has to be some consensus making within that organization or within those reports. And the criticism often is that because of that consensus, it becomes an inherently conservative with a small c reports. So debates about the information and the evidence which are used to support climate arguments are always going to take place. That's not to say that some of the examples of how this stuff is used are quite clearly outrageous or whatever, like the one I just discussed, but it's not a simple binary between those people using misinformation and those people over there using information the right way. If you're using scientific evidence to support an argument for a particular policy or a particular political debate, there's inevitably going to be some kind of simplification and emphasizing of particular aspects going on. I think that's unavoidable, but it's something that is often not talked about. So I think there's two things extending from what I've already mentioned. So I do think that in an increasingly fragmented media landscape, organizations such as the IPCC, United Nations Scientific Assessment, actually play an increasingly important role in anchoring, in providing this kind of anchor of knowledge. That's not to say that they'll always get things right or they're immune to criticism, but the amount of over many years now, but they've built up an incredible amount of prestige, I guess, and good prestige and
reputation, I guess.
Reputation is a word. Thank you. Reputation, yeah. And that reputation has been very hard earned, and there's been controversies in the past about what's been in those, but they have managed to overcome those controversies. So that has been really important. Those kind of organizations still have an important role, and what we've seen is this kind of proliferation of IPCC, I'll call them impersonators for want of a better word, or people attempting to replicate that model in other areas, including, ironically enough, around misinformation. So there's all kinds of intergovernmental panels about all kinds of issues being set up with more, some with more success than others, but that model has proved to be, quite attractive. It doesn't prevent debate. It's not to say that, the IPCC say that, therefore everyone else should just keep quiet. But it's an important anchoring role, I think. So, calling things misinformation or disinformation and leading on to that, the sorts of things around, some of the things that are described around inoculation, pre-bunking, these kinds of things. That's not really my area, but my knowledge of that literature suggests that there may be some value in some of those approaches, right? My kind of broader, more sociological point, which is my sort of background, is that describing things as kind of like unscientific to my mind, it doesn't really work very well, because the way that a lot of these things are expressed, these arguments are expressed, is they're expressed in very scientific ways, using very scientific language. This has certainly always been the case with climate skeptics. In fact, I wrote a Guardian blog about this more than 10 years ago, which didn't go down very well. But I was comparing. My main point was that climate skeptics and climate scientists or climate advocates using science talk about things in very similar ways. One may say that the climate skeptics were engaged in misinformation and disinformation, but they use very similar language. And to the more general, casual lay observer, it's quite hard to distinguish between those two. Certainly also the case with health and post-COVID and things around vaccine hesitancy, if you want to call it that, or people who are worried about vaccines. COVID vaccines is a great example of this. So one of the common, I've done a little bit of sort of preliminary work on this, but one of the common arguments that's put out against COVID vaccines was that the usual procedures for approving vaccines were not used for very understandable reasons. And this is not me saying that there was anything unsafe about it, but there were extraordinary circumstances and there were changes. It did not take the same amount of time to approve a vaccine that it would do normally. So that's a good example of using things in established science to make arguments against us. And when people read that kind of thing, and they read it in conjunction with isolated incidents of people having problems or side effects or reactions to the vaccines, drawing those kinds of bits of evidence together, no matter how kind of small or factually unrelated they might be, starts to tell a convincing story to people who might be receptive to that story. Okay, so that's not the same thing as some of the more outlandish conspiracy theories about vaccines got a microchip in it or whatever, right? There's degrees of conspiratorial thinking in some of this stuff, but it does rely on or at its centre, there often is some familiar-looking scientific rhetoric, you could call it, which is used to describe these ideas. So just kind of writing them off, and sometimes they come from people who are credentialed. So some of the climate skeptics, there's not a lot of them, but there are highly credentialed scientists on the climate skeptic side. Not a lot, but there only need to be a few of them. Similarly with health, some of those people have worked for pharmaceutical companies in the past who have been anti-COVID vaccine, very conspiracy minded. Some of them have got medical credentials. They may have been subsequently kicked out of the establishment, but they are there classically. Andrew Wakefield, who made the link between MMR and autism, was at the time a credentialed medical practitioner. I'm not saying people shouldn't say that this is misinformation or shouldn't say that this is not scientifically valid, but I think expecting that on its own just to work is not going to wash, because it often relates to more deep-rooted skepticism or concern about. It could be about medical practice in health. It could be about lack of inclusion in policy decisions around climate change. Could be all kinds of contributing factors. But it is true to say that a lot of this stuff is scientifically less rubbish, basically. But just describing it or making that argument on its own is not necessarily going to wash, because it does look very scientific, a lot of this stuff. To add to the problems we face, so this fragmentation in the media ecosystem, that's a big problem. So we have far fewer scientific journalists than we had previously. Certainly thinking about my own country in the UK, we've seen one or two high-profile science program be axed recently. Before that, there was always a problem of reports about science just regurgitating press releases that needed a bit more critical thought attached to them. That is a problem. Certainly, there is an important role for journalists there, but bearing in mind what the current landscape looks like, I don't know how realistic that is. It definitely should be part of an ideal solution. So that's one thing. More academic engaging with media is great. It's not easy, but if that can happen, that is good. And I should say that, part of the problem is that when academics do step into that space, they need to be prepared. So that's one thing that we saw with COVID. We saw a lot of scientists being thrust into not massively public roles, but anyone, certainly in the UK, who stepped up to be involved with the modelling, the scientific advisory group. They did that again at very short notice with very little preparation, and a few of those people had a very sort of bad experience, basically, because they found themselves targets of all kinds of unsavoury attacks, which has, in some cases put them off doing that kind of work in the future. You can only control what you can control, and let's just assume that's part of the job, dealing with that stuff. But we can better train and prepare academics for stepping into those roles, because I'm often surprised that academics don't know what they're getting into, basically. I mean, COVID was an extreme example, right? It's also been the case with climate scientists who have been, I've interviewed some in the past for research, and was surprised that when they kind of started writing just blog posts on their own website, that they were surprised that they started getting people criticising what they were saying. I just found that, it just made me realise that, training is needed, basically, in those areas. And I think that, related to that is thinking about, it's not just the role of scientists. So, some of the things I've talked about here are quite sociological. And therefore, we also need some people, talking about those kind of wider contexts for this knowledge. On a very simple level, we start to see that. And again, the stuff around merchants of doubt, for example, around, the ideas that some people appearing in public fora have got business reasons to present particular arguments, and they're not just presenting neutral scientific arguments, but they have a particular interest behind them. That is important to talk about that stuff more, because quite often people get away with, talking in public fora or in media without really having that background properly illuminated. So thinking about those wider contexts, basically where people are coming from when they're presenting scientific information, is important, I think, because it helps people be more literate about what perspective people are coming from. You can have arguments about how far that should go, but I'd say it's particularly a problem with things around think tanks. Again, I'm thinking about the UK in particular here. There are think tanks are, certainly the case in the US as well, a very important contributor to public debates, but it's often very unclear or opaque where they're getting their money from, and that is important. Following the money is always, and for lay people, just sort of understanding those debates, that is something that's very simple for them to understand, which again is why the roles of those kind of anchoring organisations like the IPCC are important. It's not to say they're totally free of any, they're not godlike things floating above the earth in a totally objective fashion, but the level of public trust in those kind of organisations is much higher than it is for, think tanks. So, I mean, there is an argument, I guess, for those kind of organisations. I mean, they're not very well funded. The IPCC is not very well funded. It relies mostly on free time, like academics and scientists. So, but its actual infrastructure is, it's good as far as it goes. It just doesn't have a lot of money, and it's certainly been quite, very reluctant to get involved in sort of day-to-day controversies in the past. So if there's a controversy, for example, about global temperature increase, the IPCC just won't get involved because it's seen as being political, or they just don't have the capacity to do so. So I think there is something interesting there. There's an ongoing debate to be had about whether the IPCC suffers a massive amount of inertia in the way that it's organised. It just keeps doing the same thing over and over again, basically. And there is a lot of value in that, but bearing in mind that it was formed more than 30 years ago, when the internet was barely a thing, let alone social media. The world was extremely different then. So I think there is an ongoing discussion needed about how those kinds of whether those kind of organisations can leverage the amount of public trust they have in a way of intervening in these debates in a better way, because it's not, that stuff around free bunking inoculation is all, like I say, I don't want to like dismiss it, but I think it's also about like who's trusted in the debates, and those kind of organisations have got very hard-earned reputation for trust, which could be, I think, made more use of in public fora.